The Gospel according to John, the 6th chapter. In John's Gospel, the miracles of Jesus are called signs because they reveal the true nature of God. As such, they remain within the mystery of God and cannot be brought under human control. The reading begins at verse 1. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ.
A few weeks ago, I was on an airplane coming back from Florida after visiting family. I was sitting next to a person who was very social and obviously wanted to start a conversation, which is a little risky to do when you are trapped in a small metal tube, strapped into a seat, going 500 miles an hour, 30,000 feet in the air. I mean, if the conversation goes poorly, there is nowhere to go and no excuse you can make to get out of it. So he began like we all do. "Can you finish this man's sentence?" After introductions and finding out my name, he said, "So, Chad, what do you do?" Those of you who have been around a bit know how much I hate that question because people have no idea what to think when they meet a religious professional. So more often than not, these initial introductions are awkward as people go, "Oh, well, that's nice," and then quickly change the subject to a topic that is safer to talk about, or just excuse themselves altogether. But like I said, we're on a plane and there's nowhere to go. So I ended up answering this man's question, prepared for the awkwardness that was to follow, but Mike, that was his name, he surprised me. Instead of an awkward exchange, he said something that caught me completely off guard. He said, I'm kind of envious. I bet your work is really rewarding." Wow! I mean, that statement caught me completely off guard. I've been thinking about this stranger I met on a plane and his comment since I got back. Mainly because as we continue to talk, I learned that he said what he said because he believes that his life, mainly his career, does not afford him the time or the opportunity to benefit others. And that is a sentiment that I've heard in one way or another many times before. I know a person who quit his job to go back to school and into ministry, and people around him said that he had a higher calling, that he was transitioning to do something better and more important with his life. I've also heard people say, "Oh, I can't wait to retire, so I can finally have the time to see my grandkids and give back to the community." I mean, and I get why people say these things, but I don't believe these statements are accurate. And the reason I think this is because of the story that we heard in our gospel today. This story paints an entirely different reality. Now, to focus on this story today, Jesus and his disciples are trying to get a break. And so they go into a boat and they cross the Sea of Galilee. But people just keep coming, driven by a desire for something more, for hope, for well-being. They are so desperate that they follow Jesus out into the middle of nowhere, and Jesus sees this crowd of people, these human beings, and he has compassion on them. And he asks one of his followers how they're going to feed everyone. I mean, now you can imagine the reaction. If you're going out into the middle of nowhere, well, you have to be prepared. You need to pack for the occasion. And apparently not everyone who went out to find Jesus is prepared. A few loaves of bread and fish are found, and in a sign of God's kingdom, what begins as something small, it turns into something big as Jesus feeds the crowds. Everyone has enough. No one is turned away. Scarcity gives way to an overabundance. And that's the story. It's a good story. And I assume that most people have encountered this story in some way before, even if you don't attend church regularly. It's probably the most famous of Jesus' signs and miracles. It's the only one that makes it into all four Gospels in some form. I mean, this is a story about Jesus taking very little and creating a great abundance. It's a story about Jesus caring for the needs of others. It's a story that describes the kingdom of God, God's passion for creation that ensures that there is enough for all and that no one is excluded from receiving God's gifts. Most of the messages that I've heard focus on one of these themes or a variation of them. But there's something more. John's telling of the story is unique. Let me ask you a question. Where do the 5 barley loaves and 2 fish come from? In John's telling of the story, it comes from a small boy who apparently packed a lunch to go into the wilderness to meet Jesus. So here's a question for you. What if this boy was unwilling to share the meal he had packed? If he was unwilling to share, would we even have the story? I mean, think about this for a second. Before there is a miracle, before God's mercy and grace are made visible to the masses, there is first a single, small, seemingly insignificant gift being offered. Before Jesus can feed 5,000 people, first a small boy must be willing to give up his lunch. We live in a world where there is great need. It is really not that hard to see. And I'm not just talking about other countries or other states or other cities, places like out there. No, I'm talking about the needs that exist right here in our own communities, in our own families. There are people in our surrounding areas that have healthcare needs, people who have financial needs. There are people who have emotional needs, intellectual needs, and social needs. There are many people who are unhappy and hurting because they don't have what they need in life, and so they are seriously wondering if life is worth living. I mean, this week, we are remembering the Sartell community as they are grieving the devastating impact of suicide. None of this is right. No one should have to live with unmet needs. It's not the life that God intends for God's creation. Our Bible, the prophets, Jesus, they have a great deal to say about what God desires when it comes to those living with needs. But the problem is that there are so many people who need help, and I am just one person, and we are just one church. We don't have that much to begin with. What can we really do anyway? And even if we wanted to do something, well, where do we even begin? I mean, there's a sense of overload to all of this. Plus, there is a perceived danger in giving too much away because, well, then we would be without, and we don't want that. However, one of Jesus' greatest miracles arises out of the smallest of sacrifices. God always seems to use the smallest, most insignificant of things and the most smallest of people to make gargantuan changes in the lives of others. Our Bible is full of such stories, but that seems to go against our better judgment, doesn't it? Do you believe that the smallest of things can be used by God to make the largest of differences? Honestly, do you buy that? Do you think that what you have can be used by God to become a miracle for someone else? Or is that just reserved for people who have higher callings, as my airplane neighbor thought? When God blesses us with loving relationships, money, nice things, self-esteem, that's not meant just for our benefit. But instead, these are gifts that God utilizes to give life to others. One of the biggest lies that we convince ourselves to be true is that we don't have anything to offer. Either we think that it's ours, we've earned it, and therefore we're not willing to part with it, or we look around at others and then say to ourselves, well, I'm not as good as him, or I'm not as good as her. I'm too old, I'm not smart enough, I'm on a fixed income, I'm too shy. We can't do it. And we fail to see that the blessings in our lives, when given in faith, bear the potential to be turned into a miracle by God. Small things make the biggest of differences. Can you write? Then you have a powerful tool that can be used to uplift, encourage, and support others in their daily lives. So many comments on social media are incredibly negative, full of harmful attacks bent on demeaning individuals. If you can write, well, you have the potential to make a huge difference. To receive an encouraging, grace-filled note of thanks is to experience the love of God in a powerful way, in a way that can literally save one's life. Did you have loving parents as children? So many kids don't. God can use your experience of a loving relationship to bless the lives of others who do not have such a thing. Did you eat this morning? Many did not. Our abundance of the simplest, smallest of things can become an answer to another's prayer. Our 5 barley loaves and 2 fish can become a miracle in God's hands when we step out in faith and offer it. So today, I hope you come to see this well-known miracle of Jesus, the feeding of the 5,000, from a new perspective. From the perspective of a small boy who gave up a meal so that 5,000 others could eat. I hope you come to see that God continually uses the least to make the biggest of differences, and I hope you come to understand that you have been blessed by God, not so that you can be enslaved to yourself, but set free to become a blessing to others. I hope you come to see that church is not a building, but a place where individuals gather to learn, to see the world differently through Christ's eyes. And I hope you come to see that you are loved by God. And because you are loved by God, you are called to participate in God's kingdom in the smallest of ways that can make the biggest of differences. As disciples of Christ, that is who we're called to be. If you think that there is nothing in your life that can be used by God in powerful, life-giving ways, then give me a call, because I'll be honest, I think you're wrong. It's true, we are one congregation, but even with the smallest of gifts, God can and does make great things happen. And this is the good news that we hear today. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.